Michelle Bennett was 45 years old and carried a certainty she'd held for decades, worn from use, but still whole. She knew exactly who she was. An art history professor for over 20 years, she had been married for 18, raised a daughter who now lived her own life in another city, and after the divorce had chosen, with complete conviction, to be alone. "I don't need anyone else to be happy," she would say, whenever someone hinted otherwise. And the worst part was that she truly believed it. Her routine was elegant and predictable: classes in the morning, research in the afternoon, quiet dinners at night, always accompanied only by a book and a glass of wine. Her students feared her in the first semester: straight posture, dry humor, little patience for poorly constructed excuses. But those who survived to the end of the course discovered, hidden behind that seriousness, a generous, attentive woman, capable of a quiet kindness that almost no one had the patience to wait around to see. Michelle liked the life she had built. She liked, above all, knowing where everything fit, including herself. Until the day the university hired a restorer to recover a set of rare paintings from the museum, and that restorer was named Isabelle Foster. Isabelle was 35 and had no desire whatsoever to go unnoticed. She arrived covered in paint, humming a song only she knew, greeting the cleaning staff by name before she even knew where her own studio was. Within 10 minutes, she'd already made the security guard at the front desk laugh. Within an hour, she already knew the librarian's son's name. She was the kind of woman who could turn a 10-minute coffee into a 2-hour conversation. Almost everyone liked her, including Michelle. Though Michelle preferred to call it excessive friendliness rather than admit anything else. No one could say for certain what hid behind that easy smile, maybe not even Isabelle herself. She did notice that the serious art history professor had a way of watching her from a distance, arms crossed, like someone assessing whether she could trust someone so loud. But she drew no conclusions from it. She kept the observation to herself, in no hurry to decide what to do with it. The way she kept rare pigments, waiting for the right moment to use them. The restoration studio was in the museum's basement, a spacious room with high ceilings, smelling of varnish and old wood. Isabelle settled in like someone setting up camp, brushes organized by size, an old radio playing quietly, a folding beach chair in the corner for breaks. In the first few days, Michelle only passed by on her way somewhere else. A quick good morning, a glance of professional curiosity at the canvases, nothing more. But the restoration project involved the collection Michelle had researched for years, 3 portraits from the early 20th century, of uncertain authorship, which she dreamed of correctly attributing before she retired. That gave her a perfectly reasonable excuse to show up often. "Do you always work listening to this awful radio station?" she asked, on one of the first days, finding Isabelle dancing alone while cleaning a layer of darkened varnish. "It's the only station that gets reception down here. And it's not awful, it's nostalgic. It's static with a melody." Isabelle laughed, not offended. "Are you always this categorical?" "I'm precise. Categorical is something else." "Sure thing, Professor," Isabelle replied, with a smile Michelle decided to ignore. Since the restoration would take months, the two of them ended up sharing the same space almost every day. At first, Michelle went to the restoration studio only out of obligation. But the visits became more frequent. And, without her noticing, more unnecessary. "I came to check the room's humidity. I brought this catalog, I thought it might help with your work." There was leftover coffee in the staff room, seemed a waste to throw it out. Isabelle noticed every poorly disguised excuse. And, for now, she said nothing, she just smiled, served the coffee, showed the progress of the restoration, and let Michelle stay as long as she wanted. What Isabelle didn't know was whether that meant something, or whether Michelle was simply a lonely woman who had found pleasant company for her afternoons. She preferred not to risk a guess. She'd been wrong that way too many times before. "You're different," said Melissa, Michelle's daughter, during one of the Sunday calls they'd kept up for years, always at the same time, always with the same script of questions about work, health, and the weather. "Different how?" "I don't know." "Lighter." "You laughed 3 times on this call." "I counted." Michelle rolled her eyes, but smiled where her daughter couldn't see. "Must be the museum project. It's keeping me nicely distracted. There's a new restorer, quite talented." "The one you mentioned last week?" "Did I mention her?" "Twice." "Isabelle, right?" Michelle hesitated before answering, a little longer than the question required. "Yes. Isabelle. She's good at what she does." "Sure," said Melissa, in that tone children use when they decide not to push yet, but file the information away for later. "I bet that's all it is." The deadline for the first restoration report closed in on a Thursday, and the two of them ended up staying late, alone in the museum basement, surrounded by desk lamps and the strong smell of solvent. Isabelle worked with her face inches from the canvas, focused, her hair pinned up haphazardly, a smear of ochre paint on her cheek that she hadn't noticed. "Hold still," Michelle said, approaching with a cloth. She wiped the smear with a care that surprised them both. Her fingers brushed lightly against Isabelle's chin, who went still, looking at her in a way Michelle chose not to decipher in that moment. Michelle was already pulling back when Isabelle lightly caught her wrist. Not hard. Just enough to make her stay there one more second. "Thank you," Isabelle said, still looking at her mouth. Michelle withdrew her hands slowly, too aware of the exact spot where Isabelle's fingers had touched. "There," she said, stepping back right after, the way she always did when something bothered her more than it should. They ordered food from some place near the university, split one container only because neither wanted to admit she was genuinely hungry, and kept working between bites and comments about the next stage of the restoration. It was past midnight when Isabelle, sitting in the beach chair, fell asleep mid-sentence about pigments. Michelle stayed there beside her, not daring to wake her, watching her peaceful face with an attention she couldn't have justified if anyone had asked. When she finally woke her, Isabelle rubbed her eyes, confused. "Did I fall asleep?" "About 20 minutes. Why didn't you wake me sooner?" "You looked tired," Michelle answered, and there was more truth in that than she meant to reveal. That night, on her way home, Isabelle realized she'd started looking forward to those work nights with an eagerness that went far beyond the project deadline. It was an ordinary afternoon, while Isabelle climbed a small ladder to reach the top of a huge canvas, that she lost her balance. Michelle caught her by the waist before she fell. They stood close, wrapped in the smell of turpentine mixed with something sweeter, and Michelle felt her heart race in a way she couldn't explain. Isabelle didn't pull away as quickly as she could have. She stayed there, her hand resting on Michelle's shoulder, looking at her with a hint of provocation. "Thank you," she said, in no hurry to leave that short space between them. Michelle let go of her waist too fast. "You should be more careful," she said, in a dry tone that didn't even convince herself. Isabelle smiled sideways. "You should let go more slowly." Michelle left the room in a hurry that led nowhere. Isabelle stayed by the ladder a moment longer, feeling on her waist the exact spot where Michelle's hands had been, and it took her a while to remember what she'd been doing there before the fall. Only then did she ask herself, for the first time out loud to herself, whether maybe she wasn't imagining things. After that day, Isabelle began noticing details she'd let slide before. She noticed that Michelle, when focused on listening to someone, had a habit of lowering her gaze to the speaker's mouth instead of their eyes. She noticed that, sometimes, that gaze lingered longer than simple distraction would explain. "Are you listening to me?" Isabelle asked once, amused by the other woman's distraction. "Perfectly," Michelle answered, a little flushed. "You don't even know what I just said." "I do. Varnish. Solvent. Restorer stuff." Isabelle laughed, but she kept that more carefully than she usually kept things. She still didn't know what to do with the information. She only knew that the silences between them, once comfortable, had gained a new weight, loaded with everything neither of them said out loud. One day, they went out for lunch near the university. At the restaurant, the waiter already knew Isabelle by sight. "It's been a while since you've come around." "I've been working too much." "Still single?" Isabelle smiled, in that careless way that was only hers. "Maybe not for much longer." Michelle stayed silent the rest of the lunch. On the way back, she felt an irritation building in her chest, unable to explain where it came from. "You know a lot of people," she said finally, as if it were an accusation. "I make friends easily." "I noticed." Isabelle smiled sideways, teasing. "Are you jealous?" Michelle laughed right away, almost offended by the idea. "Of course not." But she spent the whole afternoon unable to focus on anything. And Isabelle, walking beside her in silence, felt a flicker of hope she preferred not to feed. Weeks later, during an event at the university, a professor began openly flirting with Isabelle. Michelle watched from a distance, growing tenser, until she noticed he was insisting on inviting her to dinner. She approached with calculated casualness. "Isabelle. We need to talk about the restoration budget." "Is it urgent?" the professor asked, annoyed. "Quite," Michelle answered, without even looking at him. Isabelle understood immediately what was happening. Once they were alone, she couldn't resist. "Did you just save me from a date?" "I saved you from wasting time," Michelle answered, dryly. "Ah. That's what it was." Michelle walked away before Isabelle could notice the smile that kept escaping the corner of her mouth. Isabelle stood there a moment, feeling something between hope and danger. She'd been hurt before by confusing the two. "You mentioned the restorer again," said Melissa, weeks later, when the subject of Isabelle had come up for the third time in the same conversation. "We work together almost every day. It's normal for her to come up in stories." "Mom. You laughed at a bad joke she made." "You hate bad jokes." "I don't hate bad jokes." "You do, you even complain about mine." Michelle let the question hang longer than she meant to before answering. "It's just a good friendship," she said finally, in a tone that sounded more for her own benefit than her daughter's. "Sure," Melissa answered, not entirely convinced, but deciding, once again, to let it go for now. She already suspected something, though she still couldn't put a name to it. It was at a contemporary art exhibition, on a Saturday Michelle didn't even know Isabelle had attended, that she met Camille. Camille was a photographer, calm and direct, and struck up a conversation about a series of black and white portraits. They exchanged numbers. Set up a coffee date. Isabelle genuinely liked Camille, the way she laughed quietly, the way she talked about her own work with a calm enthusiasm, without the exaggeration Isabelle saw in so many people. There was, however, one uncomfortable detail. Every time Camille said something interesting, Isabelle's first impulse was to think about how she'd tell Michelle about it later. She decided to set that detail aside. She accepted an invitation for a weekend trip. Isabelle didn't show up on Friday. Michelle found it odd, but figured it was just a well-earned day off. On Monday, she still didn't show up. On Tuesday, Michelle finally asked a staff member, casually. Didn't the restorer come in this week? She's off. Went on a trip with a woman she met. Michelle only answered. Ah. She went back to her office. Tried to prepare a class. Couldn't. Closed her laptop. Opened it again. The sentence kept circling. Went on a trip with a woman. That night, she felt a tightness in her chest entirely new, something she didn't remember feeling even during her divorce. She tried to rationalize it. I'm worried because she's my friend. She's important to the project. I'm just used to having her around. None of the sentences convinced her. The following days dragged on, Michelle wandering in and out of rooms for no reason, bothered by her own inability to understand what she felt. When Isabelle came back, tanned, smiling, telling animated stories about the trip, Michelle could barely pay attention. She could only think of one question: who was that woman? She's a photographer, Isabelle said, putting things away in the studio. Very talented. We went to the mountains, spent 2 days with no cell signal. It was great. How nice, Michelle said, in a sharper tone than she intended. Isabelle stopped what she was doing and looked at her. Are you okay? Perfectly. Michelle. What? Nothing, Isabelle said, deciding not to push, though she'd noticed, with a mix of surprise and caution, the change in the other woman's tone. She didn't want to fool herself. She'd fooled herself too many times in similar situations. Days later, Isabelle mentioned, excited. I think she's going to ask me out again. Michelle smiled politely. She got home, opened a bottle of wine, and, for the first time since the divorce, cried without quite understanding why. It was in a conversation with Helen, her younger sister, that things finally found words. I think I'm being ridiculous, Michelle confided. What happened? A friend started seeing someone. I can't stop thinking about it. Helen didn't laugh right away, as Michelle expected. She grew serious, watching her closely. Michelle, you're describing jealousy. I'm not. You are. And it's not the first time I've noticed this in you. Michelle looked up, surprised. What do you mean, not the first time? Remember Rachel, your college friend? You cried for a whole month when she moved away, and said it was just missing a friend. I was 20 and already thought it was a strange amount of missing someone. That was over 20 years ago. It was. And I never said anything, because it wasn't my business, and because you never wanted to look at it yourself. But it's not the first time, Michelle. It's just the first time you can't pretend anymore. Michelle fell silent, feeling the weight of 2 decades of postponed questions crashing down at once. So imagine her getting married, Helen continued, gentler now. Michelle didn't answer. She didn't need to. Who exactly are you jealous of? Helen asked, quietly. It was the first time the question found words between them. And once spoken, they couldn't be undone. This is crazy, Michelle said, more to herself. I'm 45 years old. I was married to a man for 18. This isn't something that just happens out of nowhere. No one said it happened out of nowhere, Helen answered. Maybe it took a whole lifetime for you to let it happen. It was around this time that a fierce storm battered the city for 2 days straight, and an old leak in the museum roof, one no one had noticed in time, began dripping right above where the oldest portrait in the collection was stored, still without proper protection because the restoration of that specific piece wasn't due to begin until the following week. Isabelle discovered the problem by chance, arriving early one Saturday morning to get ahead on a report. She saw the dark stain spreading across the ceiling, right above the canvas, and felt her blood run cold. She called Michelle without even thinking about the time. "I need help right now. The oldest painting is at risk. If we don't get it out of here, the damage could be irreversible." Michelle arrived 20 minutes later, her hair pinned up in a rush and a coat thrown over the first clothes she found, and the two of them spent the whole morning moving equipment, improvising protection with tarps borrowed from maintenance, arguing over technical decisions under pressure. "Hold this corner," Isabelle asked, her voice tense, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the tarp over the frame. Michelle held it, and for a moment they were surrounded by each other, Isabelle's body nearly pressed against hers because of the tight space behind the canvas. When they finally managed to protect the piece and confirm the damage had been minimal, just a small moisture stain in the lower corner, recoverable, Isabelle sat down on the floor, exhausted, and only then let the tears fall. Michelle knelt beside her and hugged her, without a second thought. It was the first time. Neither of them moved for several seconds, seconds long enough for both to feel, at the same time, that the hug meant more than comfort. Isabelle buried her face in her shoulder, breathing deeply, letting Michelle's scent, old books and understated perfume, replace the smell of mildew and wet dust. When she realized what she'd done, Michelle pulled back, embarrassed. "Sorry." Isabelle smiled, her eyes still wet. "Don't apologize for that." The piece survived, but the incident had consequences that occupied them both for the following weeks. There was a formal investigation into the building's maintenance, tense meetings with the university administration, a delay of almost a month in the restoration schedule while the roof was fixed and the damaged material was assessed by a second specialist. Isabelle was shaken for days. She had nightmares where the painting crumbled between her fingers, and started arriving earlier, leaving later, compulsively checking the ceiling before any heavy rain. "You need to rest," Michelle said, one of those nights, finding her still in the basement at 9 at night, checking for the third time whether the tarp was secure. "What if it rains again? Then we'll deal with it again. Together." Isabelle paused, looked at her, and for a moment seemed about to say something important. But she swallowed the words and went back to work. The episode, however, had made something clear to both of them that neither had yet had the courage to name. On that morning of panic and improvised tarps, each had run to the other's side without a second's hesitation. In the following weeks, Isabelle made a decision that cost more than she expected, to genuinely invest in Camille. It wasn't a lie. She liked the way Camille treated her own photographs with the same obsessive care she gave an old canvas. She liked how available Camille seemed, no games, no running away, no impossible to decipher silences. After the leak incident, Isabelle had understood something she'd rather not have understood. What she felt for Michelle was no longer a guess. It was concrete. And, for that very reason, dangerous. Michelle had never given a sign Isabelle could point to with any certainty. Just looks that might have been just that, looks. Isabelle already knew this script from other times, falling for indecisive women, giving everything, and being left empty-handed while they went back to whatever was easier to explain to everyone else. She wasn't going to repeat it. Not with a woman who might not even know, or might not want to know, what she was capable of feeling. She chose Camille. She deliberately chose the woman who looked her in the eye and said what she felt, no roundabout way. The problem is that choosing doesn't always fix what you feel. Isabelle consciously decided to take a step back from her closeness with Michelle. It wasn't an abrupt withdrawal, but a sequence of small choices, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention. She stopped accepting the coffees that stretched to 2 hours for no reason at all. She started inventing deadlines and reports whenever Michelle suggested staying a little longer. When Michelle proposed another late work night, Isabelle refused for the first time in months. "I need to leave early today," she said, without elaborating. She started answering messages more curtly, more professionally, avoiding any subject that strayed from the restoration. She shared less and less about her own life, stopped mentioning weekend plans, opinions about movies, anything that might sound like intimacy. Michelle felt the change almost immediately, but couldn't understand the cause. She found herself missing even the things she used to pretend not to notice: Isabelle's perfume mixed with the smell of paint, the warmth of her arm brushing against hers in front of a canvas, the way she leaned in to speak quietly when the radio was loud. She asked, once, if she'd done something wrong. "It's not you," Isabelle answered, and she wasn't lying, though she wasn't telling the whole truth either. In the weeks that followed, Michelle walked around the university with a sense of loss she couldn't justify. After all, nothing had really happened between them. Just a new silence, installed without warning, hurting far more than an ordinary friendship should. Camille had planned a simple dinner at a restaurant near her studio, the kind of small, loud place where no one paid attention to anyone else. "I developed the photos from that day in the mountains," Camille said, showing some images on her phone. "Look at this one, the sunrise." Isabelle looked at the photo and smiled genuinely. "It's beautiful. You're in 3 of them. I didn't realize I'd photographed you so much. I didn't even notice." "I notice everything about you," Camille said, with an affection that was, at the same time, gentle and a small test. "Except one thing." "What?" "Where you are, when you're with me." Isabelle laughed, trying to hide her discomfort. "I'm right here." "Your body is," Camille answered, no accusation in her voice, just an observation. "Let's see about the rest." They went on with dinner as normal, laughing, talking about photography and a documentary they both wanted to watch. But the sentence stayed there between them, like a seed planted that would still take weeks to grow. A month later, over a quick coffee in the restoration studio, Isabelle shared, with a mix of pride and caution. "We made it official. We're officially dating." Michelle felt the floor drop out from under her for a moment. She gripped her bag strap so hard her fingers ached, but her voice came out steady. "That's wonderful," she said. "She seems like a good person." "She is," Isabelle answered, watching Michelle closely, trying to read something in that closed-off face. "A really good person." There was a pause that stretched longer than it should have. "I'm happy for you," Michelle said finally, and there was sincerity in it, mixed with something sharper she chose to set aside for now. Isabelle nodded, smiled, and went back to work. But that night, texting Camille goodnight, she realized she'd spent the whole day trying to guess what Michelle was thinking, and not a single minute thinking about Camille. The night of the exhibition arrived, and it was an important moment for Isabelle, months of work finally on display to the public. The restored paintings glowed under the warm light of the main hall, and guests circulated with glasses of wine, praising the work. Isabelle arrived with Camille, who held her hand naturally, introducing her to everyone as "my girlfriend, the brilliant restorer." Michelle saw them holding hands the moment she walked into the hall. She felt something clench in her chest with a force that startled her. She crossed the room, greeted them both with a perfectly polite smile. "Isabelle, the work turned out flawless." "Congratulations." "Thank you, Professor," Isabelle answered, and there was something strange in the sudden formality of the address, as if the two of them had, by mutual unspoken agreement, retreated to safer ground. "Nice to meet you, Camille," Michelle said, shaking the photographer's hand with all the courtesy she could muster. "The pleasure's mine. Isabelle talks about you a lot." Michelle raised an eyebrow, and Isabelle felt her face heat up. "Does she?" Michelle asked. "About the project," Isabelle corrected, too quickly. Camille watched them both for a moment, long enough to notice something she chose not to comment on there, in the middle of the party. Michelle said her goodbyes shortly after. But on her way home that night, she finally could no longer lie to herself. She didn't just want Isabelle's friendship. She wanted to be the woman holding that hand. In the weeks that followed, Michelle began, without admitting it to anyone, an investigation into herself. She stayed up late reading accounts of women who had discovered themselves after 40, after 50, even after 60, women who had lived decades of marriages to men before understanding why something always felt missing. She revisited old photographs from times she'd never questioned. A college professor, for whom she'd nursed an admiration she'd called, at the time, inspiration. Rachel, the friend Helen had mentioned, whose move to another city had hurt more than any friendship's ending should. None of it had a name, back then. Now, seen from a distance, it seemed shaped like a question postponed for decades. She called Helen again. "You were right about Rachel," she said, her voice low, like someone confessing something. "And about everything else, probably." "And now?" Helen asked. "Now the question has a name. And the name is Isabelle." Michelle wrote to Isabelle 7 times that week. She deleted all 7. "We need to talk." Deleted. "I wanted to tell you something." Deleted. "Isabelle, I think that." Deleted before she even finished the sentence. She was afraid of being wrong, that it was just loneliness or an attempt to fill the void left by the divorce. Afraid, above all, that it was real, and that it was already too late, now that Isabelle had a girlfriend who treated her with an openness Michelle had never offered anyone. For the first time, Michelle stopped trying to understand what Isabelle meant in her life, and admitted to herself what she truly wanted. She wanted to be with her. Recognizing that didn't lessen the fear. It only showed Michelle, more clearly than ever, exactly what she'd been running from. Camille wasn't naive. She noticed, little by little, that there was always a name that came up in Isabelle's conversations, a different glow when she talked about the museum, a way of checking her phone that didn't match someone just checking work messages. One night, after a dinner during which Isabelle had spent much of the time distracted, Camille decided to finally face the issue. "Isabelle. Are you here with me?" "Of course I am." "It doesn't seem like it." Isabelle wanted to deny it, but the words didn't come. "I like you a lot," Camille said, with a calm that hurt more than shouting would have. "But I don't want to be anyone's second choice. And I think, for a while now, I have been." "That's not fair, Camille." "Maybe it's not fair. But it's true." She paused, and this time her voice came out harder. "I asked you this weeks ago, at dinner, remember? I asked where you were when you were with me. You laughed, and I let it go because I wanted to believe it was just tiredness. But it wasn't. Camille. How long have you been thinking about her when you're with me?" Isabelle didn't answer. And the silence was answer enough for them both. "I don't want to end this angry," Camille said, her eyes already welling up, her voice trembling despite the calm she tried to maintain. "But I'm hurt, and I have that right. I spent months competing with someone who didn't even know she was in the running. That's not nothing, Isabelle." They ended it that night, without shouting, but also without the lightness Isabelle had imagined they'd have. She cried on the way home, not just over Camille, but over everything she'd tried to avoid feeling in recent months and could, finally, no longer put off. Weeks after the relationship ended, which Michelle still didn't know had ended, the two of them stayed late at the museum, arranging the last details of a new loan of artworks. The lights were almost all off. Isabelle was finishing placing the tags on the pieces. Michelle watched her in silence, standing a few steps away, unable to look away. "What is it?" Isabelle asked, without turning around. "Nothing. You've been staring at me for like 5 minutes." Michelle took a step. Then another, until only a breath of distance remained between them. Isabelle lowered her eyes to her mouth. Michelle noticed. Both their breathing changed almost at the same time. Isabelle could have stepped back. She had plenty of time to, a whole moment in which they both stood still, eyes locked, the decision hanging in the air. She didn't step back. Then Michelle took her face in both hands, and kissed her. It was a short kiss. It lasted only a few seconds. But it was enough for the ground to give way completely beneath Michelle. She pulled back suddenly, looking at Isabelle as though she'd just done something irreversible. "My God, what did I do?" She started breathing fast. "That was a mistake. I shouldn't have." She left almost running, leaving Isabelle standing there, alone, her fingers still touching her own lips, not knowing whether she was more happy or more devastated. Isabelle didn't sleep that night. She spent hours replaying the kiss, trying to understand what it had meant. If it had meant anything beyond an impulse Michelle was probably already regretting. She felt hope, for a moment, remembering the way Michelle had held her face, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She felt anger, right after, remembering the flight. She felt shame, later, wondering if she'd read the whole thing wrong, if maybe it was just a moment of weakness on Michelle's part, with no real weight behind it. She'd just ended a relationship because of that woman. She'd allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to admit what she felt. And now Michelle was vanishing, as if the kiss were a crime that needed to be hidden. Isabelle knew this script well. She'd lived it before, women who kissed in the dark and denied it in daylight. She'd sworn to herself she wouldn't put herself in that position again. And yet, here she was. Michelle spent the following days avoiding Isabelle. She didn't answer messages. She faked meetings, deadlines, commitments that didn't exist. She repeated to herself, like a mantra. It was an impulse. It was loneliness. It was a mistake I can't undo, so the best thing is to pretend it never happened. But every time she closed her eyes, she felt exactly the same sensation of that kiss, and knew, deep down, that she'd been lying to herself for days. On the other side, Isabelle also stopped reaching out. Not out of fear, but out of pride. She'd already given her part in that kiss, she'd responded with her whole body, right there, in the moment it happened, and she wasn't going to beg for an explanation Michelle clearly wasn't willing to give. The distance between them, which once seemed impossible to exist, settled in heavily, full of misunderstandings neither had the courage to undo. It was Isabelle who, after a week, decided enough was enough. She found Michelle alone in the hallway near the classroom, at the end of the day, and didn't let her deflect. "Are you going to keep pretending that never happened?" Michelle answered without the courage to look her in the eye. "It was a mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Isabelle said, and there was a hardness in her voice Michelle had never heard before. "It was a kiss. You held my face with both hands, Michelle. That's not something you do by accident." "I don't know what happened to me in that moment." "Well, I know exactly what happened to me," Isabelle answered, her voice shaking, but not from weakness. From contained anger. "I lost a relationship with a woman who treated me well because I could never stop thinking about you. And then you kiss me like that, like I was everything you'd ever wanted, and the next day you treat me like I'm something you're ashamed of." Michelle felt the weight of every word. "I'm not ashamed of you." "Then why did you run? Why didn't you answer a single message?" Isabelle took a step forward. I'm not an experiment, Michelle. I'm not some doubt you can test out and put back on the shelf if you don't like the result. Either you really want this, or we'd better go back to just being co-workers, because I can't take guessing what I am to you anymore. They stood in silence, facing each other, the empty hallway around them. I need time, Michelle said finally, her voice breaking. Not because I don't feel anything. But because I feel too much, and I don't know what to do with it. Isabelle looked at her for a moment, weighing whether that was true or just another well-constructed excuse. Fine, she said finally. I can give you time. What I can't give anymore is another kiss followed by silence. If there's a next time, it has to be your choice, said out loud, without running. For almost 3 weeks, Michelle honored the distance she herself had created. Not seeking out Isabelle, not inventing excuses to show up in the restoration studio. She spent that time questioning every certainty she'd built about herself over 45 years. She wrote in a notebook, by hand, things she'd never said out loud, the name of her college professor, Rachel's face, the exact feeling of holding Isabelle's face that night at the museum. She called Melissa, not quite sure what she was going to say, and ended up asking generic questions about her life. She wasn't ready for that conversation yet. But, for the first time, she also didn't rule out the possibility of having it, someday. It was on an ordinary morning, near the end of those 3 weeks, drinking coffee alone in the kitchen, that the answer finally became clear, not like a sudden spark, but like something that had always been there, waiting for her to stop running long enough to see it. That morning, she finally understood that she didn't need to resolve her entire identity before recognizing a simpler truth. She was in love with Isabelle. It was about her voice. The way she laughed before even finishing her own stories. The courage to say, out loud, exactly what she felt, something Michelle had never managed to do for anyone, not even for herself. Michelle went to the restoration studio one Friday afternoon, after hours, when she knew Isabelle would be alone putting away materials. I thought of 100 ways to start this conversation, she said, standing in the doorway. And none of them felt like enough. Isabelle set down her brush, cautious, not letting herself hope too easily. Then start with the simplest one. Michelle took a deep breath. I spent 45 years believing I knew who I was. I got married, raised my daughter, built an entire life without ever letting that question get close enough to be answered. And then you showed up, making noise, singing off-key, and suddenly I couldn't pretend not to see anymore. Michelle. Let me finish, please, because if I stop now I won't have the courage to continue. She took a step forward. I don't want more time. I already used the time I asked for. And what I found out is that I don't desire women, in some generic way. I desire you. Specifically you. Your laugh, your paint-stained hands, the patience you had with me even when I didn't deserve it. I don't want to be one more woman who kisses you in the dark and runs in the daylight. I want to do this right. Out loud. Isabelle stood silent for a moment, her eyes shining. Do you understand what you're asking me to believe, after everything? I do, Michelle answered. And I won't blame you if you don't believe it yet. I just wanted you to know that, this time, I didn't come here on impulse. I came because I decided to. Isabelle approached slowly, still with a trace of caution in her eyes. I need to know one thing first, she said. Is this fear of being alone, or is it about me? It's about you, Michelle answered, without hesitating this time. Only about you. It was Isabelle who closed the distance first, but it was Michelle who completed the gesture, taking her face in both hands, like the first time, except now without panic, without any desire to pull back. The kiss began slowly, almost careful, as if they were both still confirming that it was real. The caution, though, didn't last long. Isabelle pulled her in by the waist, closing whatever distance remained, and Michelle felt months of denial, of deleted messages, of heavy silences, spill over all at once. Isabelle broke the kiss for a second, her forehead resting against Michelle's, breathing deeply. "Are you sure?" "I am," Michelle said, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "I've never been more sure of anything." Isabelle smiled, and it was she who kissed her again. This time without questions, letting all the hunger built up over months finally find room to exist. Michelle's hands slid to the back of her neck, fingers lost in her hair, and for a long while neither wanted to pull away. When they finally separated, breathless, forehead against forehead, Isabelle brushed her thumb lightly over Michelle's lips, still flushed from the kiss. "You have no idea how long I waited for this." Michelle kissed the tips of her fingers before answering. "I think I waited even longer. I just didn't know for what." "This time I saw all of you," Isabelle whispered. "All of me," Michelle repeated. "And here. To stay." Their first official date was, deliberately, as ordinary as possible, a small restaurant, no exhibitions, no co-workers nearby. Isabelle arrived nervous in a way Michelle had never seen from her. "Why are you so quiet?" Michelle asked, amused. "Because this is different. Before, we only had excuses. The room's humidity, catalogs, leftover coffee. Now it's just us, with no hidden reason." Michelle smiled, reaching across the table to hold her hand. "Then let me invent one last excuse." "What is it?" "I came here because I really wanted to see you. That's all. No project, no painting, no obligation at all." Isabelle laughed, relieved, and squeezed her hand back. After dinner, with their glasses nearly empty, the conversation grew deeper. "How was your marriage?" Isabelle asked, carefully, like someone stepping into territory she didn't want to damage. Michelle thought before answering. "Good, for a long time. Or I thought it was good, because I never had another reference to compare it to. We got along, raised Melissa together, shared the house without major fights. But looking back now, I think it was more a comfortable partnership than a passion. I never felt what I feel for you." Isabelle held her hand across the table. "And before me, how many serious relationships did you have?" Michelle asked, in a rush of curiosity she couldn't hold back. Isabelle gave a crooked, somewhat sad smile. "A few. None very long. I have a bad track record of falling for women who didn't know what they wanted, or who knew and it wasn't me." She paused. "That's why it took me so long to believe in you. It wasn't distrust of who you are. It was fear of repeating the same old story. And now? Now I think that, for the first time, the story is different," Isabelle answered, squeezing her hand a little tighter. It was already late when they left the restaurant. They walked slowly to Michelle's building, in no hurry for the night to end. At the apartment door, Isabelle stopped, hesitant. "I should probably go, right?" Michelle looked at the empty street, then at her. "I spent months inventing reasons for you to stay. I'm not about to start inventing reasons for you to leave now." Isabelle smiled before kissing her. This time, Michelle didn't wait for her to lead. She grabbed her by the waist and pulled her inside, closing the door with her foot. Weeks later, at a university dinner celebrating the completion of the restoration, a colleague asked Michelle, in a merely curious tone, whether she'd come with someone. There was a moment of hesitation, the kind of moment that, months earlier, would have made Michelle invent an evasive answer. "I came with Isabelle," she said finally. "My girlfriend." The word came out easier than she expected, but her heart still raced saying it. The colleague raised his eyebrows, visibly surprised, not hostile, just caught off guard, and took a second to recover before smiling. I didn't know. You two make a lovely couple. Isabelle, who had heard everything from a few steps away, came over and put her arm around Michelle's waist, with a smile too big for her face. Say it again, she whispered, just for her. My girlfriend, Michelle repeated, now without any hesitation at all, and this time louder than necessary. The introduction to Melissa happened on a Sunday, and Michelle spent the entire morning nervous, straightening the table more times than necessary. When the doorbell rang, in a fit of nervousness she hadn't expected of herself, she introduced Isabelle to her daughter by simply saying, "This is Isabelle. A friend." Isabelle smiled, polite, but something hardened behind the smile. She greeted Melissa normally, helped set the table, told a bad joke that got a laugh. But in the kitchen, while Michelle went for more glasses, she whispered, "A friend? Isabelle. I understand if you don't want to tell her today. But don't call me a friend to my face after everything we've been through." That hurt. Michelle felt her stomach turn, realizing her own mistake. I panicked. I'm sorry. It wasn't about you, it was about me not knowing yet how to say it out loud to her. Then say it now. They went back to the living room, and Michelle, still flushed, sat down beside her daughter. I need to correct something. Isabelle isn't just a friend. She's my girlfriend. Melissa was silent for a moment, not out of rejection, but genuine surprise, processing the information. Wow. Okay. That explains the Sunday calls, she said finally, with a half smile. I kind of already suspected, Mom. You laughed 3 times in one call, I counted once. Isabelle laughed, relieved, and the tension in the room gradually eased, giving way to a dinner that stretched well past dessert, full of curious questions, museum stories, and a quiet relief Michelle carried with her the rest of the night. Months later, the university organized a permanent exhibition of the restored works, the same canvases that had silently witnessed everything that happened between the two of them. Michelle and Isabelle walked together through the hall, hand in hand, stopping in front of each painting like someone revisiting a chapter they already knew, but that could still surprise them. Remember when you kissed me right there? Isabelle asked, pointing to the corner where the lights had gone nearly dark that night. I remember running away right after, Michelle answered, smiling, no shame at all in the memory now. I remember that too. Michelle stopped, turned to her, and said, quietly, like someone finally understanding the size of her own luck. I spent my whole life thinking I knew myself. You showed up, and I realized there were still chapters I'd never read. Isabelle smiled before answering, pulling her closer by the hand. Then it's a good thing we have the rest of our lives to read the others. And there, in the middle of the hall, among the paintings that had watched them become a couple, Michelle kissed her again, unhurried, and, above all, with no desire at all to run.